The sun blazed mercilessly over a quiet suburban street, the kind of day that seemed perfect for a ride. A low, thunderous rumble echoed as a group of bikers roared down the road, their leather jackets glinting in the sunlight. They were loud, confident, and clearly looking for attention. Among them, a towering figure named Mike led the pack. With his thick arms crossed over his chest and a smirk that never seemed to leave his face, Mike had made a name for himself as someone who didn't back down, especially if he thought he could get a laugh at someone else's expense. Across the street, sitting on a bench near the entrance of a small park, was a man named Terrence. He was a quiet, unassuming figure in his mid-30s, wearing a neatly pressed shirt and a pair of dark sunglasses. A cane rested beside him, its polished wood glinting faintly in the sunlight. Terrence wasn't just enjoying the day. This park was his refuge, a place where he often came to think and escape the stares he got elsewhere. His wheelchair was parked discreetly beside him, but it didn't take much to notice the way he moved carefully, his motions deliberate and controlled. The bikers pulled into the parking lot, their engines roaring as they came to a dramatic stop. Terrence barely lifted his head, focusing instead on the birds chirping in the trees above. To him, they were just another noisy group passing through. But to Mike, Terrence was an opportunity, a chance to flex his self-proclaimed sense of humor in front of his crew. "Hey, look at this guy." Mike's voice boomed, drawing the attention of his buddies. The others chuckled, their laughter carrying across the empty lot. Terrence turned his head slightly, his expression calm but unreadable behind the dark glasses. "What's a guy like you doing out here alone?" Mike continued, swaggering closer. "You waiting for someone to push you home?" His words were dripping with mockery, and his friends howled with laughter. Terrence didn't respond. He simply adjusted his glasses and folded his hands in his lap. The lack of reaction seemed to fuel Mike further. He leaned in closer, towering over the seated man. "What, cat got your tongue? Or are you just too scared to say something?" The group of bikers edged closer, forming a loose circle around Terrence. A younger member of the group, clearly uneasy, muttered, "Come on, Mike. Let's just leave the guy alone." But Mike waved him off, his grin widening. Terrence finally moved, tilting his head as if considering his next words carefully. When he spoke, his voice was steady, calm, and carried an edge of quiet confidence. "I'd advise you to walk away." Mike froze for a split second, surprised by the unexpected response. Then, with a bark of laughter, he turned to his friends. "You hear that? He advises me. What are you gonna do, call the cops?" Terrence didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his phone, his fingers moving gracefully over the screen. Mike leaned in closer, his smirk replaced by a sneer. "Oh, is this the part where you call your mommy?" The other bikers chuckled nervously, but there was a shift in the air, a tension none of them could quite put their finger on. Terrence's calm demeanor hadn't changed, and there was something unsettling about how unbothered he seemed. Then, with deliberate precision, Terrence pressed a button on his phone and brought it to his ear. His voice was low but firm. "This is Terrence. I need a favor." Mike's laughter faltered. The other bikers exchanged uneasy glances, the bravado in their eyes dimming. Who was this guy calling? And why did he sound so sure of himself? As Terrence continued to speak, his words growing quieter, the bikers began to shift uncomfortably. Mike, trying to hold on to his confidence, crossed his arms and scoffed. "Yeah, sure. Call whoever you want. It's not gonna change anything." But deep down, even Mike couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that they had just made a mistake, a big one. Terrence ended the call without another word, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He remained calm, his hands resting on his lap as though the escalating tension around him didn't concern him in the slightest. His silence was unnerving, and Mike, who thrived on confrontation, found himself searching for something, anything, that would put him back in control of the situation. "Who'd you call her?" Mike barked, his voice louder now, but lacking the confidence it had moments ago. "You think someone's gonna come out here and save you?" The other bikers, still forming a loose circle, exchanged glances. The younger one who had spoken earlier shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should go, Mike. This guy's not doing anything." Mike shot him a glare that silenced any further protest. "Stay out of it, Jesse," he snapped before turning his attention back to Terrence. "You don't scare me, old man." Terrence, for his part, remained completely still. His face betrayed no emotion, but there was something in his posture that hinted at an unshakable inner strength. It wasn't defiance, nor was it fear. It was something deeper, a kind of confidence that came from knowing you held all the cards. "You don't even know who you're messing with, do you?" Terrence finally said, his voice calm and measured. "You think you're having fun, but you've got no idea what you've stepped into." Mike let out a harsh laugh, though it sounded forced. "Yeah. And who are you supposed to be? Some big shot lawyer? A politician? Come on, man, you're just some guy in a wheelchair." Terrence tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "Let's just say I have friends who don't appreciate bullies." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. The bikers, who had been laughing and jeering moments before, were now eerily quiet. Even Mike, who prided himself on his bravado, felt a flicker of doubt. There was something about the way Terrence spoke, the way he carried himself, that made it hard to dismiss him as just another victim. "Friends, huh?" Mike said, trying to regain control. "Well, they're not here now, are they?" Terrence didn't respond. Instead, he reached for his cane, gripping it firmly as he shifted his weight slightly. His movements were slow but deliberate, and for the first time the bikers noticed the scars on his hands, faint but unmistakable marks that hinted at a past filled with struggle and hardship. It was a detail they hadn't paid attention to before, but now it seemed impossible to ignore. Jesse, the youngest biker, took a step back. "Mike, maybe we should just leave. This doesn't feel right." Mike rounded on him, his frustration boiling over. "What's your problem? He's just trying to scare us. Don't fall for it." But even as he spoke, Mike's own conviction wavered. There was something unsettling about the way Terrence remained so calm, so composed. It was as if he knew something they didn't, and the uncertainty was beginning to gnaw at Mike. Terrence leaned back slightly, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest of his chair. "It's funny," he said, almost to himself. "People like you always think you're in control. You think you can push people around and get away with it, but life has a way of catching up to you." His words were quiet, almost conversational, but they carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. The bikers shifted uneasily, the tension in the air growing thicker with each passing moment. Mike clenched his fists, his frustration mounting. "Enough with the cryptic talk. You got something to say it." Terrence smiled faintly, though it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the kind of smile that came from knowing something no one else did. "You'll find out soon enough." The sound of an engine approaching broke the tense silence. The bikers turned to see a sleek black SUV pulling into the parking lot. Its windows were tinted, and the vehicle moved with an air of purpose, coming to a stop a short distance from the group. The driver's door opened, and a tall man in a sharp suit stepped out. His expression was neutral, but his eyes scanned the scene with a calculated precision that made the bikers uneasy. "Mr. Terrence," the man said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Are you all right?" Terrence gave a small nod. "I'm fine, Marcus. Just a little misunderstanding." Mike's jaw tightened as he watched the man approach. This wasn't what he had expected. The man named Marcus carried himself with a quiet confidence, his every movement deliberate and controlled. He wasn't flashy, but there was an undeniable presence about him that commanded respect. "Who are you?" Mike demanded, his voice louder than it needed to be. "What's this about?" Marcus ignored him, focusing instead on Terrence. "Do you need me to handle this, sir?" Terrence shook his head. "No, Marcus. Let them figure it out for themselves." Marcus gave a small nod before turning his attention to the bikers. His gaze was calm but piercing, and for the first time, the group felt truly out of their depth. Mike, still clinging to his bravado, took a step forward. "We don't need any trouble," he said, though his tone betrayed his unease. "We were just talking." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Is that so?" The silence that followed was deafening. The bikers, once so full of confidence, now found themselves at a loss for words. The weight of their actions was beginning to sink in, and they couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a mistake they might not be able to walk away from. Terrence adjusted his glasses, his calm demeanor unchanged. "You're lucky today," he said quietly. "But next time, think twice before you decide to pick on someone who doesn't fit your idea of strength." The words were simple, but they carried a power that left the bikers speechless. Marcus took a step back, his hand resting on the door of the SUV. "Shall we go, sir?" Terrence nodded, and with that he was helped into the vehicle. The SUV's engine roared to life, and within moments it was gone, leaving the bikers standing in stunned silence. Mike, for all his bluster, found himself unable to speak. He glanced at his crew, their expressions mirroring the unease he felt. Whatever had just happened, it was clear that they had underestimated the man they had thought was an easy target. The bikers stood in stunned silence long after the black SUV disappeared from view. Mike's hands were balled into fists at his sides, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. No one spoke at first, their earlier bravado replaced by an oppressive unease. Jesse, the youngest of the group, finally broke the silence. "Mike, what just happened?" Mike turned on him, his frustration boiling over. "What do you mean, what happened?" "Nothing happened." His voice was sharp, but it lacked conviction. Deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Jess shook his head, his voice quieter now. "That guy wasn't just some random dude. You saw the way that other guy treated him, calling him sir and everything. He's got connections, Mike, real ones." The others murmured in agreement, their earlier laughter replaced by nervous whispers. One of the older bikers, a grizzled man named Hank, rubbed the back of his neck. "We might have stirred up something we didn't mean to. That wasn't normal." Mike glared at him. "You're all acting like a bunch of scared kids. So what if he called someone? What's he gonna do? File a report? Call his lawyer? Let him try." But even as he spoke, Mike's voice wavered. The memory of Terrence's calm, unshakable demeanor gnawed at him. The group eventually dispersed, each biker heading home with an unspoken tension hanging over them. Jesse couldn't shake the feeling that they'd made a grave mistake. He spent the night tossing and turning, replaying the encounter in his mind. There was something about the way Terrence had spoken, the way he carried himself, that felt dangerous. The next morning, Mike woke to a pounding on his door. Groggy and irritated, he opened it to find Hank standing there, looking pale and shaken. "You need to see this," Hank said, thrusting his phone into Mike's hands. "What is it?" Mike muttered, squinting at the screen. Hank's voice was low, almost a whisper. "It's him." Mike's eyes focused on the video playing on Hank's phone. It was a news clip, a polished report featuring none other than Terrence. But this wasn't just any story. The segment described Terrence as a decorated veteran, a former intelligence officer with a history of service in high-stakes global operations. Terrence Williams, the reporter said, her tone reverent. Known for his unmatched skills in crisis management and his role in negotiating delicate peace treaties. He's also been a vocal advocate for disability rights, using his own experiences to inspire others. Mike's stomach sank as the report continued, detailing Terrence's connections to influential figures across industries, politicians, CEOs, even members of law enforcement. The footage cut to a clip of Terrence giving a speech at a major conference, his presence commanding and his words resonant. "I believe strength isn't about what you show," Terrence said in the clip, his voice steady and firm. "It's about how you protect those who can't protect themselves. And sometimes it's about teaching a lesson to those who think they're untouchable." Mike's face went pale as the video ended. He handed the phone back to Hank without a word, his mind racing. "You see now?" Hank said, his voice shaking. "We messed with the wrong guy. This isn't gonna go away, Mike." Mike clenched his jaw, his frustration mounting. "So what? He's not gonna do anything. People like that don't get their hands dirty. They use lawyers, meetings, whatever. We'll just stay out of his way and it'll blow over." But even as he said it, Mike couldn't ignore the knot of dread tightening in his chest. Meanwhile, Terrence sat in his study, the room lined with books and mementos from his career. Marcus stood nearby, his posture relaxed but alert. "Do you want me to take further action?" Marcus asked, his voice calm. Terrence shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "Not yet. Let's see how they handle themselves first. Sometimes, letting people sit with their mistakes is punishment enough." Marcus nodded, though he remained watchful. "And if they don't learn?" Terrence leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Then we'll remind them." Across town, Jesse couldn't shake his unease. Unlike Mike, he didn't have the luxury of ignoring his gut feelings. He decided to do some digging of his own, spending hours online piecing together information about Terrence. The more he found, the more his respect and fear grew. Terrence wasn't just connected. He was respected, admired, and most importantly, untouchable in ways that mattered. Jess debated reaching out to him, wondering if an apology could make things right. But every time he picked up his phone, his nerves got the better of him. As the days passed, subtle changes began to creep into the bikers' lives. Mike noticed that his usual hangout spots weren't as welcoming as they used to be. Bartenders who once greeted him warmly now seemed distant. Jess's hours at work were suddenly cut, with no clear explanation. Hank received an unexpected visit from an old acquaintance, who casually mentioned that he'd heard about the incident at the park. It was small, almost imperceptible at first, but the pressure was building. The bikers began to realize that their actions had set something in motion, something they couldn't control. Terrence, for his part, remained patient. He wasn't interested in revenge for its own sake, but he believed in accountability. And if these men needed to learn a lesson, he was more than willing to teach it. The days dragged on, and the tension among the bikers grew unbearable. What had once been a tight-knit group, full of boisterous laughter and shared bravado, was now fractured by unease. They avoided their usual meeting spots, their conversations clipped and cautious. None of them wanted to admit it outright, but the shadow of Terence lingered over them like a storm cloud, growing darker with each passing day. Mike tried to keep up appearances, brushing off their concerns with forced confidence. "He's not doing anything to us," he said one evening, pacing in Hank's garage while the others sat in silence. "If he was going to, he'd have done it by now. We're just psyching ourselves out." But even as he spoke, his voice lacked the usual fire. He couldn't ignore the way his phone buzzed less frequently with calls from his contacts, or how his boss had started looking at him differently during their shifts. Hank, who had always been the most pragmatic of the group, finally spoke up. "Mike, you don't get it. This isn't about some big dramatic move. It's subtle. It's the way people look at us now, like they know something we don't. It's the doors that were open last week and are suddenly closed. He doesn't have to lift a finger. He's already got us cornered." Jesse nodded, his leg bouncing nervously. "I don't know about you guys, but I'm not waiting around for this to get worse. We should just apologize, make it right. Maybe it's not too late to fix this." Mike scoffed, waving him off. "You think saying sorry is going to change anything? It'll just make us look weak. Besides, we didn't even do anything that bad. It's not like we hurt him." Jess's voice rose, frustration boiling over. "We didn't hurt him. Mike, we humiliated him in front of everyone. A disabled man, no less. Don't you see how wrong that is? This isn't about looking weak. It's about doing what's right." The argument escalated, voices bouncing off the walls of the garage. But underneath the shouting, each of them felt the same creeping dread. No matter what they said or did, the weight of their actions was catching up to them. Meanwhile, Terence was methodical in his approach. He didn't need to retaliate with force or threats. He knew that fear and anticipation were far more effective. Through his connections, he ensured that the bikers felt the consequences of their actions in ways they couldn't ignore. Small changes, a delayed shipment for Mike's business, a denied loan for Hank, whispers of doubt surrounding Jess's work ethic, were enough to make them question everything. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jesse finally made up his mind. He couldn't keep living with the guilt, nor could he handle the growing unease that had taken over his life. He found Terence's address online, his hands trembling as he wrote it down. He wasn't sure what he would say, but he knew he had to try. Apologizing face-to-face was the only way he could begin to make amends. The next night, Jesse drove to Terence's house, a modest but well-kept home on a quiet street. The neighborhood was peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling inside him. As he approached the door, he rehearsed his words over and over in his mind. His heart pounded as he raised his hand to knock. Before he could, the door opened, and there stood Terence, his expression calm but unreadable. Jesse froze, his prepared speech evaporating from his mind. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on Jesse like a lead blanket. I'm sorry," Jesse finally stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "For what we did. It was wrong, and I should have stopped it." Terence regarded him for a long moment, his gaze steady and unflinching. "It takes courage to admit when you've done wrong," he said finally, his tone measured. "But words only mean so much. What are you willing to do to make it right?" Jesse swallowed hard, his nerves fraying. "Anything, just tell me what I need to do." Terence nodded, stepping aside and motioning for Jess to enter. As he crossed the threshold, Jesse couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something far bigger than he could understand. Back at the garage, the rest of the bikers were oblivious to Jess's decision. Mike was pacing again, his agitation boiling over. "I'm not letting this guy ruin my life," he growled. "If he wants to play games, fine. Two can play." Hank looked uneasy. "What are you planning, Mike? Don't do something stupid." Mike's eyes burned with frustration. "I'm not sitting around waiting for him to destroy us. If he wants to mess with us, we'll mess with him right back." The others exchanged uneasy glances but didn't challenge him. None of them wanted to admit it, but fear had made them desperate. Desperation, as they were about to learn, often led to mistakes. That night, Mike's plan took shape. It was reckless and impulsive, but he convinced himself it was the only way to regain control. What he didn't realize was that Terence was always one step ahead, his calm exterior hiding a mind that had spent decades mastering the art of strategy. As Mike's plan moved forward, the tension reached its breaking point. The bikers were hurtling toward a confrontation they couldn't escape, their actions setting the stage for an explosive climax. All the while, Terrence remained patient, watching as they stumbled deeper into the web they had unknowingly woven themselves. As Mike's plan unfolded, a sense of false confidence began to seep into the group. He rallied the others with his fiery rhetoric, convincing them that they had been backed into a corner and had no choice but to fight back. Even Hank, who had been the voice of reason, found himself swept up in Mike's fervor. The group's shared anxiety turned into a dangerous determination, blinding them to the consequences of their actions. Late one evening, under the cover of darkness, the bikers gathered in a secluded lot on the outskirts of town. Their motorcycles were lined up in a grim procession, engines idling softly as they finalized their plan. Mike stood at the center, his voice low but charged with adrenaline. "We'll send a message," he said, his eyes darting between them. "No more sitting around waiting for him to destroy us. We take the fight to him." Jess's absence was noted but ignored. They assumed he had bailed, unable to handle the pressure. What they didn't know was that Jesse was already deep in conversation with Terrence, sharing every detail of Mike's reckless plan. Jess's guilt had driven him to do the unthinkable, betray his friends to the very man they feared most. Terrence listened carefully, his calm demeanor never wavering. "I appreciate your honesty, Jesse," Terrence said after a long pause. "But you have to understand something. This isn't just about you or your friends. It's about setting a precedent. Actions have consequences, and those consequences don't disappear just because someone feels regret." Jesse nodded, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his decision. "I know, I couldn't stand by and let them make things worse. They're not thinking straight, Terrence. They're scared." Terrence regarded him thoughtfully. "Fear can make people do foolish things, but it can also be a powerful teacher. Let's make sure the lesson they learn sticks." Meanwhile, Mike and the others were making their way to Terrence's neighborhood, their headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. The plan was simple but reckless: intimidate Terrence into backing down. Mike had convinced himself that a show of force would be enough to regain control of the situation. But as they approached the quiet street, a strange sensation began to creep over them. The first sign that something was wrong came when they realized they weren't alone. Parked cars lined the street, far more than usual for a neighborhood like this. Figures emerged from the shadows, their presence silent but unmistakable. Men and women of all ages stood in quiet solidarity, their expressions unreadable. They weren't aggressive, but their sheer numbers were enough to make the bikers hesitate. "What the hell is this?" Hank muttered, his voice barely audible over the rumble of their engines. Mike clenched his jaw, refusing to show any sign of weakness. "It's nothing. Just keep moving." But as they rolled closer to Terrence's house, it became clear that this was no coincidence. The crowd grew thicker, their silent stares following the bikers' every move. When they finally reached the house, they saw Terrence standing on the porch, his phone in hand. He didn't look surprised to see them. In fact, he looked as though he had been waiting. "Evening, gentlemen," Terrence called out, his voice calm and steady. "Nice night for a ride, isn't it?" Mike killed his engine and dismounted, his bravado faltering slightly under Terrence's gaze. "We're not here to chat," he said, trying to sound tough. "You've been messing with us, and we're not gonna stand for it." Terrence tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Messing with you? That's an interesting way to put it. I'd say I've been giving you a taste of accountability." Mike took a step forward, his fists clenched. "Cut the crap. We're here to make sure you back off. Whatever you're doing, it ends now." Terrence raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unchanged. "And what exactly do you think you're going to do, Mike? Intimidate me? Threaten me? I think you've misunderstood the situation. You see, you don't hold the power here. I do." As if on cue, the silent crowd began to move, stepping closer and tightening their circle around the bikers. The atmosphere grew heavier, the weight of their collective presence suffocating. Mike's confidence wavered as he realized just how outnumbered they were. "What's going on?" Hank whispered, his voice tinged with panic. Terrence stepped off the porch, his movements slow and deliberate. "You've spent so much time trying to scare others that you never considered what it feels like to be on the receiving end. But don't worry, I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to teach you a lesson you won't forget." Before Mike could respond, Terrence's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me," he said, stepping away to take the call. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado crumbling as the crowd closed in around them. What they didn't know was that the call was from someone far more powerful than they could have imagined. The second plot twist was about to unfold, and it would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about Terrence and themselves.